You are listening to the Businesstalk podcast, a show that brings you conversation with global research scholars and academicians from around the world. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Today we have the privilege and pleasure of welcoming Dr. Sergei Guriev as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Before we begin, let me briefly introduce today's guest. Professor Sergei Guriev serves as the 10th Dean of London Business School, a leading economist and global thought leader. Professor Sergei contributes actively to several prominent academic and policy networks. He is a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research, a member of the Group of 30, a global member of the Trilateral Commission, a senior member of the Institut Universitaire de France, an ordinary member of the Academia Europaea, and an honorary foreign member of the American Economic Association. Before joining London Business School, Professor Guriev shaped economic scholarship and institutional leadership at Sciences Po in Paris, where he served as a tenured professor of economics and the university's first provost. His public service experience spans global development and financial economics. He was chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Earlier in his career, he led the New Economic School in Moscow as rector, earning recognition from the World Economic Forum in 2006 as a young global leader. Uniting academic vision with international policy expertise, Professor Sergei continues to advance business education and economic research with a focus on innovation, governance, and global impact. In this episode, Professor Sergei Guriev discusses his research, political information, and network effects, exploring why political campaigns sometimes trigger results opposite to their intentions. Now, without keeping you waiting any longer, let us warmly welcome Dr. Sergei Guriev to the conversation. Professor Sergei, it's a privilege to have you with us today, and we are truly grateful for the time you have taken to be here.
Thank you very much, Deepak, for inviting me. Really pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, your papers start from a simple puzzle. Political campaigns often backfire or have very unpredictable effect on voters. What first convinced you that social networks might be a key missing piece in understanding these surprises?
Thank you, Deepak. So this is a paper about how information campaign may actually backfire, and we wanted to know how that works in practice. And when we say social networks, I need to say a very important thing. When we talk about social networks, we use the conventional definition of what social network is, not social media. So we talk about networks between people, networks within society, dissemination of information between friends and family and neighbors. And that, of course, has huge implications for businesses around the world, where you want to introduce a new strategy, you want to convince the organization of something, you run an information campaign explaining to your colleagues what you want to achieve. And when you talk to people, they seem to be convinced. But when you look at the organization as a whole, you may actually see backfiring. And we didn't preconceive this idea, but now we have evidence that sometimes what happens is when you talk to people, you manage to convince them on average. But a small minority may be not convinced, maybe even outraged with your message, and they're more vocal and they talk to people outside the room. So overall, campaign actually backfires, even though within the room, on average, you've done a good job. And so we are working with data from politics rather than from business. Why? Because this is a unique setting where you can actually measure a lot of things, where you can actually see the action that people take by voting for the politician that the campaign supports or tries to stand up to. And so you can actually see how different people, affected or not affected, people who are exposed indirectly or directly to your information, change their votes. And by running a randomized control trial, we can actually pin down the causal effect of the information campaign on actions people take.
Professor, you exploit a unique feature of Argentina's electoral system, where results are reported at the sub-tracking measure level. Can you walk us through how this institutional detail allowed you to cleanly separate direct and indirect spillover effect of the campaign?
Exactly. So one of the things which I said is important about our experiment, which was run in Argentina during their presidential election in 2023. We can see how this campaign around several policy proposals of then outsider political candidate Milei, how that affected the votes for Milei. And so in Argentina, you can actually measure the votes at a very granular level. Usually in every country, you can see the results by precinct, which is usually a neighborhood, if we are talking about urban area, or a village, or several villages next to each other. But in Argentina, you do it at the level of a table. So when you come to vote, based on your last name, you go to vote in one of, say, 8 tables. And average precinct, average polling station in our case is about 300 people. So you're directed to one of the mesas. Mesa means table. And basically, what we can do, we can target the information campaign at one mesa, but not at the other one. And we can see how we can measure the impact of this information campaign on people who got the information campaign directly or people who live in the same neighborhood, the same precinct, but didn't receive the leaflets from the information campaign themselves. So we can actually measure how those people who are exposed by social network, by their neighbors who receive the leaflets, how they change their votes. And so by looking at directly exposed messes and neighboring messes, which receive no leaflets, we can indeed identify the direct effect of the campaign, which means people who receive the leaflets, and indirect effect of the campaign, where people were talked to by those directly exposed, but have not received leaflets themselves. And this is where social network comes to play, where some people who didn't like the campaign's leaflets convinced their neighbors. And so these effects may be quite heterogeneous and they can go in the opposite direction. So what is exciting about this paper is we managed to not just manage to pin down those direct and indirect effects, but also show that they can go in the opposite direction and indirect effects can actually outweigh the direct effects.
Professor, in the experiment, the education leaflet reduced support for Javier Milei among directly treated voters, but increased his support among untreated voters in treated precincts. How do you interpret this striking combination of a negative direct effect and a positive, larger indirect effect?
Right. So let me explain the context. So Milei came up with several proposals, some of which were challenged by experts. And so the campaign was about two of those proposals, and one of them, as you mentioned, was about schools, about education, where Milei's proposal was pretty much remove public funding of schools and move to a voucher system. Now, the experts in Argentina believe that this would be an unfortunate decision, especially for poorer parts of the country, which have no money to send kids to voucher-funded schools. And our experiment was in rural, poor province, and we didn't look at the city, at the main city in the province. So the campaign actually targeted the voters in rural areas. And basically, this message of the campaign was this is the proposal from presidential candidate Milei, and this is what experts say. So if you take this leaflet at face value, you probably are less likely to vote for President Milei. Now, what happened, as you rightly said, on average, people who received the leaflets reduced their vote share of Milei by 20 percentage points. It's a huge number. So for every 100 leaflets that were sent, Milei lost 20 votes. This is not nothing at all. It's a huge persuasion rate. Not unprecedented, not exceptional, but significant. However, when we look at those indirectly exposed mesas, indirectly exposed voters, we see that indeed the effect is in the opposite direction. It's 30% in favor of Milei, from which you have this paradox, and this paradox can be explained by two things: heterogeneity of impact and social networks. What do we mean by heterogeneity? So people who receive those leaflets, the directly exposed persons, they are not all convinced to the same extent. On average, they are convinced. As I said, on average, leaflets turn 20% of the vote in the intended direction. But there are some people, apparently a minority, but some people who see this campaign as a campaign that elites, urban elites, launched against a leader who wants to protect ordinary people. And we see this backlash in many settings where people understand that elites are trying to undermine somebody who wants to stand up to the elites. And so this minority, which received those leaflets, were so outraged, then when they talked to their neighbors, they were more motivated to talk to more people and tended to be more vocal and convincing. So people they talked to turned in the opposite direction in greater numbers. So overall effect of this campaign was actually in favor of Milei, even though the campaign itself intended to inform people about deficiencies of Milei's policy proposals. Now, I should say that this is actually a new result. Nobody's managed to disentangle and pin down the direct and indirect effects. But what is also surprising is how we can see the heterogeneity and social network driving this backlash. Now, it's not just the experiment we did. We also ran a post-experiment survey where we asked people, how many did you talk to? What did you think? And the survey results also corroborate the story I just shared.
Professor, the dollarization leaflet, in contrast, had essentially no measurable impact. What does this asymmetry between the education and dollarization messages teach us about when information campaigns can still move voters and when they become redundant noise?
Correct. The campaign was focusing on two proposals. One was the schools education voucher system proposal that I just discussed, but there was also another leaflet talking about dollarization. So Milei suggested that Argentina should dollarize, so give up the peso and only use dollars. There are countries around the world that do that. For example, in Ecuador, the local currency is actually American dollar. In El Salvador, the same. So Milei suggested that. But again, experts said Argentina doesn't have enough dollar reserves. So this transition to a dollarized system will be smooth. So actually, when Milei won the primaries in what's called zero round or pass around in August 2023, peso immediately tanked by 30 or 40%. Why? Because markets panicked, because this idea of dollarization that Milei was promoting at that time would result in a much higher price levels, because prices would have adjusted upwards, because Argentina didn't have enough dollars to move to dollars without price adjustments. So academic economists, other experts would say it's a very dangerous proposal. But as you rightly said, we don't find any impact of that campaign on voting for or against Milei. It's a precisely estimated zero. Why do we think that is the case? We think because everybody by that stage was already informed about that policy proposal. So the idea of dollarization was already priced in. People knew this is what Milei stands for. And the information campaign was not changing information set of anybody. Anybody knew before the campaign what the proposal is and made up their mind whether to vote or don't vote for Milei. And this shows also that sometimes we should keep in mind that when we run those experiments, people are already informed and we cannot move their views by a new campaign simply because they've already seen this news on social media, in newspapers, on radio or TV. So this is what we find.
Professor, a key mechanism you propose is that A small minority of voters who disbelieve the leaflet become highly motivated to talk to others and, in effect, campaign for the outsider. How does your model formalize this idea that the outraged minority can dominate the overall spillover effect?
Correct. So the paper is not just an empirical paper with an experiment and a survey. We also have a theoretical model where we model the choices of voters. And indeed, the key component, as I mentioned, is heterogeneity. So some people are convinced by the campaign, but some change their opinion in the opposite direction because they feel that the elites are trying to undermine a person who stands up to them. Now, as I said, in the directly exposed group, these people are probably a minority, as our data show. We show that on average, the directly exposed group is experiencing the intended effect of the campaign. But we also model explicitly in the theoretical model, we model the capacity of those people to talk to others, what you call spillover effect, where people talk to other neighbors who live next door, who live sometimes in the same building or even apartment or the same house, because as I said, messes are separated by last name, not even by address. So they can talk to friends and family and neighbors and convince them. And what we find is this minority is much more outraged than the silent majority and talks to neighbors much more and probably is more persuasive. And maybe indeed people who are directly exposed by the campaign, their majority who's convinced by the campaign, believes that these arguments are so persuasive that they don't need to share them. Everybody knows that these proposals are not beneficial for them. So there is this argument of a vocal minority, which I think, coming back to what I said in the beginning, matters not just for politics. It has a huge implication for corporate life, where you come into the room, you seem to have convinced majority, but minority may see the risks or mistakes in your proposal and talk a lot to people outside the room. And what may happen is your proposal experiences a backlash because you don't take into account heterogeneity and social networks or spillover effects.
Professor later ran a vignette survey in Salta, asking people to imagine believing or disbelieving a leaflet that criticizes an outsider. What did you learn from that survey about who talks to whom and why the disbelievers are particularly active in persuading their peers?
Yes, exactly. As I mentioned, we didn't limit the study to the experiment itself. We also ran a survey later on. Of course, it was very hard to go back to exactly the same individuals that we set an experiment with, but we did survey in the same place and the same set of locations, and we asked people. To what extent, if they imagine that they receive a leaflet like this or a leaflet like this, they would change their views. And then we ask them how they would talk to others after receiving this leaflet, and to what extent people who were not convinced by the leaflet would talk to more people. And this is what we find, exactly in line with what I just said before. We find corroboration of this story that people who didn't like the leaflet were more outraged and wanted to talk to more people, more neighbors about their views from the leaflet.
Professor, in your theoretical framework, the same campaign can have positive direct effect and negative indirect effect, depending on group sizes and communication patterns. Could you explain in intuitive terms the simple two-group example where a convinced majority still loses to a mobilized minority?
Yes, correct. So that's exactly what I was talking about. Where imagine the say 100 voters, and think about 60 of them being persuaded by the leaflet and 40 being outraged by the leaflet. And so on average, the leaflet brings 20 votes to the organizers of the campaign. The campaign manages to gain 20 votes out of this 100. But don't forget that these 40 are unhappy about this campaign, and they step outside this 100 voters group and talk to other hundreds. And if they talk very loudly and actively and to more people and spend more time and effort on rallying up against this information campaign, they can turn more votes outside this 100 and therefore create negative spillover effect and go in the opposite direction. However, there is nothing guaranteed about this, but our paper is the first one which shows that it's possible. We pin down those effects, we measure them, we quantify them, and we show that in this particular case, yes, the campaign backfires. Even though within the group that campaign targets, it delivers the expected result. But overall, it does backfire because those vocal minorities talk to others outside the room.
Professor, your finding speaks directly to practitioners who test messages in focus groups but ignore network spillovers. If you are advising a campaign that wants to criticize an outsider candidate, what specific pitfalls would you warn them about based on your results?
Yes, I would suggest to them to take this into account and think about heterogeneity of voters and go deeper into understanding why some audiences are not convinced or some minorities in the audiences are not convinced. And most importantly, don't take outcomes, average outcomes from the main exposed audience as the ultimate measure of success of the campaign. So the campaign which performs really well in a focus group or in a small pilot study may actually backfire. And so in order to understand what to expect from the campaign, the campaign designers should think about heterogeneous impact and see who is in the focus group or in the pilot study is convinced or unconvinced and why, and to what extent these people are likely to channel their outrage outside of the room. So this is actually a message that is, of course, obvious, but often it's easier to look at average effects and forget about heterogeneity. And it's also sometimes it's easier just to focus on the outcome within the directly exposed audience and forget about overall impact. And luckily, with this Argentinian election, with this heterogeneity of effects within Mesa and across Mesas, we can pin down and measure those effects and deliver this message in a rigorous way.
Professor, the paper suggests that campaigns against anti-allied outsiders may be especially prone to backlash because voters can interpret criticism as an establishment attack. How far do you think your Argentina results travel to cases like Trump, Bolsonaro, and Bukele?
Right. It's always very hard to measure the backlash, but at various anecdotal levels in political science analysis, you see that indeed this idea of backlash is very powerful, especially in the rise of various leaders across the world, where voters, especially voters who feel left behind, voters who feel that establishment elites don't care about them, they look for a candidate who can stand up against the elite for those left behind voters. And often the establishment message to these voters is actually rejected, and voters mobilize around this anti-establishment candidate and support the candidate in the election. I should say that we talk about anti-establishment and not populist in this context because eventually President Milei is not a populist politician, and we see that what he's doing sometimes is deeply unpopular, challenges establishment, but eventually these are the policies that, say, IMF would recommend to implement. And from a point of view of economic orthodoxy, many of those policies are bitter medicine, but medicine that helps make Argentina more successful economically, which is very different from various Latin American populists in the past. So in that case, I would not talk about President Milei as a populist.
Professor, I need to conclude this episode with one last question. Stepping back, what do your findings imply for the broader fight against misinformation and populism, especially for NGOs and fact checkers who rely on expert-based messages that may look effective in experiments but can backfire once they enter real social networks?
I think it's an excellent question. And indeed, as I said, in this paper, we talk about social networks, not about social media. But I actually have another paper on which one of the co-authors of this paper is also a co-author, Ekaterina Zhuravskaya. The other two co-authors are Theo Marquise and Émeric Henry. We just got accepted at Econometrica. And this paper is exactly about misinformation on social media. So that paper, we just got accepted at Econometrica, and I just got this email from a friend, which shows that Financial Times just profiled this paper. So this paper shows how different policies or interventions help slow down dissemination of false news without undermining propagation of true news. So what we did in this paper, we again ran a couple of experiments, in that case in the United States in 2024 around midterm elections and 2022 midterm elections, 2024 presidential elections, where we actually presented voters with false and true information from both parts of this political spectrum. And we tried to use various tools to see what can increase or reduce sharing of those tweets. In that case, it was Twitter in 2022, X in 2024, to what extent voters were likely to share the content on their social media. And we had several tools. One of them would be, for example, a confirmation click, where you share, but then we ask you to confirm that you actually want to share this content. That, of course, slows down sharing of all content, not just false, but also true, because it's an additional cost and friction added to sharing process. We also looked at the tool which was asking voters to assess veracity and partisanship of the information. So given people to think about this particular piece of content. We also used a tool which was fact-checking, where we said to people, look, for this particular content, there is fact-checking, independent fact-checking available. And the final policy which we used was priming intervention, where we just showed people a statement saying, remember that there is a lot of misinformation circulating on social media. Please bear this in mind while sharing on social media. So it was a very short health warning, if you like, similar to health warning on cigarette packs or alcohol bottles, but even shorter, right? This intervention was extremely effective. Why? Because it actually slowed down by a large margin, slowed down dissemination and sharing of false news, but did not affect, and in some experiments actually increased sharing of true news on social media. And the reason we think it worked, and we have a theoretical model, structural estimation, so we can pin down the mechanisms. The mechanism that we find evidence for is raising the salience of the reputation. This health warning reminds people that they need to care about how their audience perceives their own credibility. And turns out that this simple health warning really raises awareness and reduces sharing of false news without without reducing circulation of true news. Why is that important? Because platforms care about dissemination of content overall. And so if you have an intervention which slows down dissemination of both true and false content, platforms may be unhappy about their business model. But if you produce a tool which reduces false but accelerates true, this is something that platforms are happy to implement, and that's why we are very excited about this policy. That is the main finding of this paper, which has got accepted in Econometrica journal.
Thank you, Professor Guriev, for joining us and for sharing rich insights from your research on political information and network effects. Your work not only deepens our understanding of how companies actually operate through social networks, but also offers vital lessons for practitioners, policymakers, and citizens navigating today's complex information environment. It has been a privilege to explore your findings from the Argentina experiment to the broader implications for outsider candidates and anti-elite narratives. We are grateful for your time, your clarity, and your generosity in unpacking both the theory and real-world stats. We look forward to following your future research and welcome you back for another conversation very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Deepak, for inviting me.